everyone, and welcome to this first video from Holly's Crafty Shoebox. Today I'm going to be talking about Tunisian crochet and how you can stop it curling up at the edges. Tunisian crochet tends to curl up at the edges due to the way it's worked. Obviously it's worked in rows back and forward, you're never actually turning the work like you would in regular crochet. This causes all of the tension to be placed on the right side of the fabric, which then leads to the edges curling up. There are a couple of things you can do to try and deal with this. Obviously the first thing you'd think of would be blocking, which works really well with natural fibres like wool, but not quite as well if you're using something like an acrylic yarn like I am. Obviously acrylic yarn has the tendency to go back to its worked state rather than its block state, which is the sort of the main difference between using acrylic and wool yarns. So, like I said, there are 4 ways I tried to see if I could prevent Tunisian crochet from curling up at the edges. The first thing to think about with Tunisian crochet is the hook size that you choose to use. With my yarn, I'm using a double knit acrylic. You would typically use a 4mm, which is usually the size they recommend on the ball band. However, if you do so, you do end up with this quite tightly crocheted fabric which does curl quite severely at the edges. The typical figure people give you is to go 3mm bigger than the size recommended by the yarn label, which gives you quite a nice loose fabric like so. Obviously we're still getting that slight curl, but it's nowhere near as severe as with the 4mm one. The next technique you can try is to work a row or 2 of double crochet at either end of your piece. This obviously has the effect of turning the work at least once, so that the tension's slightly more evenly distributed at the bottom and at the top. So again, I've done 2 swatches. I've got a 4mm one and one done on a 7mm hook. Obviously, again, we've got the 4mm being quite tightly crocheted and the 7mm sample being quite loosely crocheted. You can see the differences in the edges, and also you can see at the top where it was quite difficult to work that row of double crochet, so instead I've just gone between the 2 bars. So the next technique is to work your foundation row into the back bumps of the foundation chain, like so. So you can see on the 4mm swatch that it's still quite tightly crocheted, but it doesn't curl quite as severely as the other 2 samples have. But the 7mm one does seem to curl slightly more. Obviously the issue with this technique is that you only ever have 1 foundation row, which does make it quite difficult to match your cast on and cast off edges. So the final technique is to work a couple of rows of Tunisian Purl stitch at the beginning and end of your piece. Because the Tunisian Purl stitch involves working with the yarn at the front of your work, it does kind of distribute that tension slightly better, and you do also get this quite nice decorative look with it as well. So again, we've got the 4mm swatch and the 7mm swatch, and you can already tell that these are slightly less curled than before. I think I've been handling them a bit too much and now they don't want to lie completely flat. But there you can see the really neat edges. Again, 4mm is still a bit too tight for my liking, but the 7mm is quite nice. And again, you can work this throughout your piece as sort of like a decorative motif. I've got 2 swatches I did here. This one involves 2 rows of Tunisian Purl stitch, then 5 of the Tunisian simple stitch, the row of Tunisian Purl stitch in the middle to try and maintain that flat tension, another 5 of Tunisian simple stitch, and then the final 2 of Tunisian Purl stitch. And in this one we have 5 rows of purl stitch, then simple stitch, and then again with the purl stitch. So if you wanted to make a scarf, you've got that nice border which you could quite easily attach a fringe or some pom-poms to hide any raw edges. Okay, so those are all the methods I tried. For me, the biggest difference was definitely working with a bigger hook. So just bear in mind that 3mm rule. Obviously, if you want a slightly tighter fabric, it might be worth trying 2mm, or maybe even 1.5 mm will make enough of a difference. I think for my next Tunisian project I'll definitely be working with the Tunisian Purl stitch method of starting off. Obviously these are just swatches, they were done quite quickly, so they're not the neatest thing in the world, but you know, if you've got the time to experiment, it's always worth trying to work to your regular tension. Okay, so this has been my first video. It's been quite an experience. If you've got any comments you want to leave, please put them down below, and I will see you next time.